I had planned to show you some slides, but I think I'd much rather just speak with you. So I don't have a slideshow. It's going to be just me talking with you. And what I want to do is talk to you about the work that we do in the DA's office, and maybe talk to you about some current issues and challenges that we're seeing. But I also want to be available to answer any questions you have about anything that I'm saying or anything you're wondering. That now's your chance to ask the elected DA of Washington County any question you have about the criminal justice system. And let me start by saying it's really interesting, our criminal justice system. All of us have preconceived ideas and notions about our justice system. And a lot of it's based on a source that may not be entirely accurate. Does anyone know what that source is? Twitter. Well, Twitter, yeah, that's a good one. I wasn't even thinking about that. Twitter. What other sources do you think we have that may not be entirely accurate? Media. Okay, what else? Facebook, sure. Social media. But let me start by saying, finish this sentence. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say. How do you know that?
Because it was on every
Yeah, TV, NCIS, Law and Order. So a lot of us, unless you've been Mirandized by a police officer prior to an arrest, I'm not asking that question right now. But a lot of us base our knowledge from television, from Hollywood, or what we read on the internet or on our phones, or what we see on the evening news about happening somewhere in America. And understandably, we think that's what's happening here in Washington County, in Forest Grove, or wherever. And part of it's correct. The way that Law and Order sets things up, where you've got the prosecutor and the defense and a judge and a jury, that's exactly what it's like in TV or in real life. But a lot of it's not accurate. No case gets resolved in an hour. The prosecutors are a lot better looking in real life, right? So what I'm hoping to do is talk with you a little bit about what it's like in real life, what we're actually seeing in the Washington County DA's office. Let me take a step back and tell you a little bit more about me. I live in Sherwood, which is in Washington County. It's a town of about 20,000 people. So how big is Forest Grove? Okay, so a little smaller than Forest Grove. Got 3 kids. They're all in middle school and elementary school. And like a lot of you, my wife and I are raising our family here, and kids here, and we're just trying to make sure that the kids are safe and that we can go about our day and live in a good environment, which is, I think, what all of us here in this room want. And that's really the mission of the DA's office. It's keeping people safe. In fact, our mission is protecting our community and seeking justice. Those are the 2 guideposts for our mission statement. I practiced law as a lawyer for 20 years now. Started out doing work in Portland with companies that were involved in lawsuits. And then I was really drawn toward coming to the DA's office, probably because I watched too much Law and Order when I was younger. But I really wanted to be that person in court, making a case, arguing a case, prosecuting someone for committing a crime, helping out a victim. The longer I've worked in the DA's office, the more I've come to realize it's not so much about prosecuting the bad guy. That's what people think the prosecutors do. It's more about helping the crime victims. We see over 12,000 crime victims in our office.
No.
From a really traumatic event happening. Maybe their home was burglarized. Maybe a loved one was assaulted. Maybe they were assaulted. Something was stolen. They come to the DA's office not quite knowing what to expect. And you think about your experience with all sorts of government agencies, post office, DMV, the courts. Sometimes people don't have the highest expectations, and there's confusion and anxiety coming into it. So one thing that we really try and do in the DA's office is meet people where they are. These victims who are traumatized by something happening, so we can address that issue, help them achieve some level of safety and confidence in a really difficult environment, the court system. Has anyone here had jury duty before? Okay. How did you feel that first day when you knew you had to be in court at a certain time? Were you all a little bit nervous or anxious? Just where do I park my car? Where do I have to be? What's it going to be like? Those types of questions. And then I always think about that, and I imagine, now what if I'm here not because I have jury duty, but because something bad happened to me or a loved one? And that's kind of what we try and meet our victims when they come to us every day. Every day there's victims sitting in our lobby to get to that 12,000 or so victims annually. What I'd like to do when I'm thinking about kind of my conversation with you today is I've got a title for my presentation. I'm going to call it the good, the bad, and the ugly. So many of you might know there's a famous movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Some of you haven't seen that. And I recommend it when you get back to your house. So there you go, famous Western. So now, before I get into the good, the bad, and the ugly, I'm going to just start with a story, because that every single day, that's what we deal with in terms of stories in our office, the real things that are happening to folks. And this is a real story, happened about 6 months ago here in Washington County, in Sherwood, actually. The week before Christmas, there was a woman. She was up at about 1 a.m. Everyone else in her house, the family, everyone else in her house was asleep. And she was awake. This is the week of Christmas. Does anyone have a guess what she might have been doing? At 1 in the morning? Wrapping presents, right? So it's exactly what she's doing. She's wrapping presents. Her phone was next to her on the dining room table and it buzzed. And she looked at it, and she had what many of you might have. She had these Ring cameras outside of her house. Do you have those? And you can set it so that it buzzes with an alert when it captures movement. So she looked at her phone, and what she saw was there was a man actively trying to break into her house at that moment. And there's the video of him doing it. So she understandably is really upset. She immediately calls up to her husband, who was asleep. They pick up the phone and they do what probably anyone in this room would do: call 911. And the Sherwood police got there in less than 2 minutes. They ended up bringing in a unit from the sheriff's office who had a canine. He did a dog track to try and find this man, and they found him a couple hours later hiding in another yard, and he was arrested. So that is, obviously we don't want that to happen, but that is everything working well in terms of the system responding when something bad happens. What we later learned is that was 1 a.m. A few hours earlier, that same man had broken into another home. He had actually broken into a home in Northwest Portland. He had walked up a hill from a homeless encampment where he was living. And he had taken a brick and threw it through a basement level window of a home in Northwest Portland and gained entry. That was about 11 p.m. or so. Everyone in that house was asleep, except for an 8-year-old little girl who was in her bedroom with the light on, reading. She wasn't supposed to be awake, because do any of you have this experience with your kids? They're supposed to be asleep, but they weren't. She was awake reading. She heard everything I'm about to tell you happened. But she was so scared to get up out of bed. She didn't want to get up out of bed and walk across the hall and tell her parents there's someone downstairs. She just sat there in her bed and listened to it all. So the man threw a brick through the window in the basement, gained entry, walked into the main area of the home, and began rooting around and grabbing things and taking things, and doing who knows what as he was trying to decide what to steal. After a while, he decided to go upstairs. So he started walking up the stairs to where the family was sleeping. And just by sheer happenstance, he actually bumps into something hanging on a wall, and it came crashing down. And that woke up the parents. First thing the parents thought when they heard the crash was, anyone have a guess?
What about the kid?
Well, which of my kids is out of bed, right? Because isn't that what you might think as a parent? Who's out of bed? Get back in bed. And so they hear the noise, they come outside, the father does, and up in his upstairs area confronts this man. And it could have gone horribly bad at that point, but luckily the man turned and ran. He ran downstairs. He'd already grabbed the keys to the family car. The car was in the driveway. For whatever reason, he got in the car and he drove south from Portland, and he ended up, of all places, in Sherwood. And that's when he broke into the home of the first woman I told you about, or tried to break in. The family in Portland, they did the same thing that woman in Sherwood did. They immediately picked up the phone, called 911. 10 minutes later, the 911 dispatcher answered, 911, what's your emergency? And why am I telling you that story?
2 different counties.
2 different counties, 2 different situations. It's truly a tale of 2 cities. And it's a tale of, I think, a public safety system in Washington County that has its challenges, no doubt. And I'm going to talk to you about that in a moment. But it's, generally speaking, working well. We live in a very safe community. We live, in fact, the safest large county in Oregon. The 5 most populous counties, we are the safest large county, safest of those 5. Our crime rate is 30% below the state average. When I say crime rate, I'm talking about both property crimes, so stealing things, cars, things like that. And I'm talking about violent crime, people attacking other people. So we're below the state average. Obviously, what's happening in Portland and in Multnomah County is a very different story. And for someone to say 10 minutes after you've been on hold, what's your emergency? It just highlights the real tragedy of the problem. So that's a tale of two cities. And when you think about the work that we do in not just the DA's office, but our public safety system, it really all comes back down to keeping people safe. It's a highly politicized environment that we're in now. I mean, I guarantee you, when you think about criminal justice issues and police issues, these are the issues that people have very strong feelings about different ways. Even in this room, I'm sure if we took a poll and everyone honestly said how they felt about everything, sure, people have different feelings about different things, and that's totally okay. But it's super important, I think, that we keep the partisan politics out of the courthouse, out of the DA's office, and focus on keeping folks safe. So that's the story I thought I'd share, just to kind of give you an understanding of a real life. This is what we're dealing with. Our office is prosecuting that man for breaking in, trying to break into the Sherwood house. He was arrested. He was taken to the jail and is currently being prosecuted. So that's, the case is still pending. So that's a good thing. Now, I said this would be the good, the bad, and the ugly. So let me start with the good news. And again, interrupt me, please. Ask me questions, throw them out there. Happy to answer them. Yes.
Going back to this scenario, two thoughts come to mind. One is, does Multnomah County then go after him after you're done with him, or how does that function? And could you clarify what the news reported about the police officers do or do not need to ever give a Miranda warning anymore?
Yes. So on the first issue, when somebody commits a crime in more than one county, the counties will usually talk and communicate with each other to coordinate. So in that particular case, both Multnomah County and Washington County filed charges. So the way it works is the district attorney's office files the criminal charges anytime someone commits a crime anywhere in a county. So in our office, we work with all the different city police departments, Forest Grove, Tualatin, Tiger, Hillsborough, every city in Washington County, along with the sheriff's office, which patrols the entire county, including the unincorporated areas. Same thing is true in Multnomah County. There are fewer city police departments because the one big city, of course, is Portland. But anytime a crime happens, that crime gets referred to the DA's office after the police do an investigation. Then the DA's office makes a decision about whether there's enough evidence to file charges. So in that particular case, Multnomah County and Washington County both filed charges against that man. Your second question about Miranda rights, so that, you know, the right to remain silent, et cetera. The requirement in Oregon is that you need to be advised of those rights, not when you're arrested, but it's prior to being interviewed by the police. So it's a common misconception that the police have to read you your rights when they arrest you. It just so happens that they almost always do, because as soon as they arrest you, they're probably also going to ask you questions. Those rights before you are asked questions, so that we can use your answers in court, so that you are told, hey, you have a right to not talk, you have a right to a lawyer, etc. But there's no requirement that they're read to you at the moment you're arrested. Does that answer your question?
So that's what the clarification was from the Supreme Court.
Oh, I'm not sure what case you're thinking of.
All right, we'll talk later.
Okay. Yeah. Now, so again, the good news in Washington County, I talked to you about our crime rates. Now, it's one thing for me to tell you about crime rates, and another thing for you to think about what it's like to live in Washington County. And so remember, I live here too. My neighbors and I, we have the same concerns you do. So for example, if I park my car outside at night, I double check to make sure it's locked, because I don't want someone checking the door to try and get in. I worry about my catalytic converter, just like you all should worry about yours. And I think about, when I drop my kids off at school, I think about the same things, school shootings, you know, things like that. I worry deeply about those issues. But the good news is that while crime absolutely does happen here, we have a very good system at addressing it when it occurs, and hopefully deterring people from committing it before they actually do. When someone does commit a crime, they are arrested by the police, sent to the DA's office for us to file charges. We take some of those cases and we prosecute people and we send them to jail or to prison. So the county jail is basically a holding facility for people while a case is pending, or a place that someone might spend a short amount of time for a short punishment. The state prison system is where you might go for a longer period, typically more than a year in custody. You would go to the state prison system. And there are people that are, in my opinion, very deserving of going to jail or to prison, and we send them there. However, I also think there's people where we can sometimes get a better result if we don't send them there. And I'm thinking about people that are dealing with challenges like addiction or mental health. Now, it depends on the nature of the person and the nature of the crime, because someone with a mental health issue and a knife or a gun is every bit as dangerous, if not more, than someone without the mental health issue. So sometimes there's a public safety issue that is overlapping and complicating things. But we look for ways to address what I call the root cause of criminal activity. So take, for example, someone who's stealing, shoplifting from a department store, or stealing something from a car, or even stealing a car. There are different reasons that people might commit that crime. One reason is greed. You know, I want that, it's not mine, I'm going to steal it. There's no treatment for greed. The only response is to prosecute someone and to create a penalty that dissuades that person from committing a crime down the road, and hopefully dissuades other people from doing that. So when it comes to greed, I want, that's more traditional prosecution. Some people commit that crime because they're dealing with a drug addiction. They're addicted to methamphetamines, they're addicted to opioids like heroin or other opioids, and they're stealing things to sell them to fuel the addiction. And so that gets more complicated because we can prosecute them in the more traditional way, send them to jail or to prison. But then the question is, are we addressing the underlying cause? And what's going to happen when that person gets released from jail or prison? Almost everybody we send to jail or prison gets released eventually and comes and lives right back in the community. And so just thinking about it from the long game, we want to send people to jail or prison when we need to, but we also want to address the underlying addiction or mental health issue in a way that's more sustainable so that when they come back, they're not committing the same crime again. So sometimes those people are still deserving of going to jail or prison. Other times we use what are called specialty and treatment courts. You may have heard about some of these in the news. One is called a drug court or a mental health court, or we have one called a veterans treatment court. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was wondering, is Washington County planning to expand their Washington County Health and Human Services to address the growing need? And on top of that, I'd like to know what your opinion is on the recent changes in the drug laws in Oregon, what an impact that's been having for the last 6 months.
Well, your questions are perfect because you're leading you to the bad and the ugly. So I remember good, bad, and the ugly. So yes, the county is expanding its outreach when it comes to addressing what I'm going to use a word called behavioral health. And it's an umbrella word that can refer to both mental health issues and addiction issues. So behavioral health, yes, they're expanding that. And the county's done things, for example, there's a center called the Hawthorne Center. It's a place where anyone with a mental health issue can go and get immediate help. It's a good thing. It gives the police an opportunity to someone there to a jail. The county has what's called a mental health response team, which pairs a police officer with a life work clinician, a mental health clinician. So the two of them can go out and provide an alternate response to not taking someone to jail, but can address a mental health issue in a better way that's more reactive to what's happening. The county is also creating something called the Center for Addiction Triage Treatment, CATT, or CAT for short, basically a drug addiction treatment effort that the county has. All of these things cost a lot of money, and that's the challenge. So let me transition now to the bad. The bad in Washington County is we as a system, we as a county are struggling. The need what we need to address outpaces the resources that we have to address it. And, it's kind of like picking between, which of your children do you feed? Because each of these things is important. Yes, sir.
What are those resources?
So the county is, so when we talk about resources in the criminal justice system, we can talk about state resources, county resources, and city resources. And they're all municipal resources that you and I pay for with our tax dollars. And so the state, for example, provides the funding for the court system to function, the judges and the court system and the prison system. That's the state. Our tax dollars, which is to the state. The county provides funding for things that are county-wide services, like the district attorney's office that provides prosecution services for the entire county, So Forest Grove, Sherwood, Tigard, Walton, wherever it might be. Sheriff's Office, jail, all of that's county funded. The Center for Addiction Triage and Treatment, a county service funded by the county, primarily funded by your property tax dollars. And also funded by other revenue streams the county has, but primarily it's your tax dollars. The county has what's called a public safety levy. It's basically a tax on top of a tax that we all pay, that we vote on every 5 years. Think of it as icing on the cake. So if you think of the cake, the main part of the county budget, that's the general fund. That's what our property tax dollars typically go toward. The icing on the cake, the extra, is this extra levy, this extra tax that we say, yeah, we're willing to pay a little bit extra on our property taxes so we can provide this enhanced level of services that we want to be able to provide. And so the voters vote on that every 5 years. There's also a library levy the voters vote on as well. So that's the county. And in the cities, you know, it's the police, it's the things that you pay for your city taxes as well that provide the direct services. So when you call 911, a Forest Grove officer responds, paid for by your city dollars.
Yeah, one more question on top of that. So what about the programs? And I'm asking because my wife works for Washington County Health and Human Services and
Okay.
programs. So I could hear about this every day.
Well, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Well, what do you mean programs?
Well, addiction programs.
Okay.
Mental health and addiction programs.
So the answer kind of depends, because under that umbrella of addiction programs, there are a lot of different initiatives and efforts that are out there, and each one might be funded differently. So some are funded in the ways I've just described. There are grant funds that are out there as well. So you can apply for a grant from the federal government or from the state government to fund a program or a specialty effort. So for example, we have a specialty court called a Veterans Treatment Court. What we do, this is funded by a grant, a competitive grant that we applied for. So not everyone gets it. We applied for it, we got it, and we're using it to fund people to make this court work. And what we do is we take service veterans who've been honorably discharged from one of the branches of the United States military, and they're dealing with some type of trauma, and there's a connection between that trauma and their service. So the classic example would be someone who's, let's say, been injured in combat and now has an addiction to opioids because they started out on the painkillers. That's a common example. Another example might be a PTSD type situation, and they're self-medicating with methamphetamines or opioids or alcohol. But in that context, not only are they addicted and dealing with that addiction and have that service, they also go out and they commit a crime. So we select certain people from that program, people that don't have a very high public safety risk, but who have nevertheless committed a crime. And we give them an opportunity to go through a difficult program where at the end of the day, if they graduate, the benefit to them is they can have their crime reduced, or if it's a lower level crime, they can have it dismissed. The benefit to us is what's called recidivism. Does anyone know what that word means, recidivism? Yes, sir. Repeats. Yeah, so when we measure the effectiveness of a program, it's one thing for me to say, yeah, it's really working. But another thing is to look at how well is it working? And that's judged by what's called a recidivism rate. After a certain number of years, 3 or 5 years, you measure how many of the people who have graduated from that program have gone out and committed a new crime. You want your recidivism rate to be low, because we don't want them to commit new crimes. So our Veterans Treatment Court, we've had for 4 years now. I don't know the total number of graduates we've had. We've had one person recidivate. So only one of our graduates, and it's in the dozens and dozens, it's not over 100, but dozens and dozens of graduates. One person has gone out and committed a new crime. That's really, really good, because if we took that same group of people and we did the more traditional route of prosecution in jail and prison, the rate of recidivism I guarantee you would be higher. So examples like that, using grant funding or other sources of revenue, are ways that we're trying to address root causes of crime. And I'm really proud to say in Washington County, we are a leader at doing that. But the key is not everyone belongs in that program. Some people need to be prosecuted the more traditional route. Other people we should use the specialty court approach for. So that's kind of one of the challenges. Yes.
I apologize for you just opening up for questions whenever. But,
Well, I'm the one that did it, so you don't have to apologize.
But so is the resources, when we get to resources in the DA's office and the courts, is it that we don't have enough attorneys and or judges? Because it seems that pre-COVID, it took a while to get through the system.
Yeah.
Now with post-COVID, it takes like for freaking ever for anything to get done. So, I mean, just how, where is that all at?
Yeah, so Washington County is an example of a county that 25, 30 years ago looked very different than it does today. And anyone who's lived here long enough knows that. And you can experience that if you drive on 26 or 217 or Murray or any of our big thoroughfares, TV highway. There's just more people, more stuff. And the challenge is every time they build a new neighborhood or a new shopping complex or a new condominium or apartment complex, are they also investing in the infrastructure that makes our society work? And the infrastructure includes the court system, the DA's office, and police departments, and all that stuff, because people need that. Every major development that comes in, a certain number of those people are going to get divorced, are going to get involved in lawsuits, are going to witness a crime, be a victim of a crime, or commit a crime. And they're going to be funneled through our court system. Our court system, though, has not kept pace with the growth of the county. So in that 25 to 30-year period, if you think back to it, the court system has not expanded as quickly as the rest of the county has expanded. So it's a bit like a slinky, where part of the county is growing rapidly, other parts are lagging behind. And that's a challenge for Washington County because we're one of those counties that's growing up really, really fast. So Multnomah County has, if you go back 30 years ago, it was still a really big county, right? Portland and all the infrastructure. Washington County was very different 30 years ago. And so, for example, in our court system, we have 15 circuit court judges, which is about 1/3 the number of circuit court judges that Multnomah County has. Last year and the year before, we had more criminal cases filed in Washington County than Multnomah County did. So think about that for a second. We're a county that's about 200,000 fewer people with a crime rate that's much lower, and yet we filed more criminal cases than Multnomah County did. There's a lot of reasons for that. Part of that is some policy decisions by the public safety leaders in Multnomah County not to prosecute certain types of crime. But another reason is we're growing quickly and we're not keeping up pace. DA's office is the same challenge. Our prosecutors in our office have a caseload that's about 180% the caseload of their counterparts in the Multnomah County DA's office. That makes recruiting difficult for me and retention for lawyers because they look at their counterparts one county over and they're working a lot less. We've got a really good group of people. Our victim advocates, who are the social workers that work with crime victims when they come in the door and talk to them about their rights and help them through the process, they have a similar caseload that's about 1.5 times the caseload of their counterparts in Multnomah County. So addressing those challenges is critical. The jail in Washington County during normal times has a full capacity of 572 beds. That makes it the second smallest jail per capita in the state. So per capita, thinking about the county size, Washington County's jail is the second smallest in the state. If you're arrested anywhere in Washington County, there's only one place you go to. It's the single county jail that we have. And during COVID, that jail capacity was reduced to allow for social distancing. So that created a cascade of effects. And one of those effects was if you went out and shoplifted, or if you went out and stole a car, you wouldn't be arrested. So what happens when a criminal commits a crime and they know they're not going to be arrested? A certain number of them are just going to do it again. And that's exactly what began to happen during COVID. Shoplifting was epidemic alongside the epidemic that we were dealing with. And criminals began to realize there'd be certain crimes they wouldn't be arrested for. We had one guy who actually told a Beaverton police officer, "You can't arrest me." Now, I do not recommend you say that to an officer. Yes, I can. And you arrested him right then and there because he shoplifted with a knife, which is actually a robbery. Yeah. So the answer is, well, you can't commit this crime. So COVID actually taught us some interesting lessons. And one of them was the deterrent effect of prosecution. The ability for the police to say, if you do this, you will get in trouble. There are certain people in our community that need that to not commit a crime. I'm guessing most people in this room don't need that, but some people do. And so we're still dealing with the hangover effect, the after effect of COVID. The jail is not completely open. And part of that now has to do with some staffing levels. Because just like all of our companies that you read about in the news and the inability to hire and retain employees, the sheriff's office and local police departments are struggling when it comes to police officers. And doing police work, I don't have to tell any of you, It's really, really tough work these days, because on top of COVID, we were dealing with, these very important, long overdue conversations about equity and equality in our criminal justice system. So a lot of stuff was happening in the last 2 years. So now I've talked about the good, we're doing well, we've got specialty courts, we've got a good, strong public safety system despite our challenges. Talked about the bad, which is this resource challenge that we're dealing with. I do want to shift and talk about what I'm going to call the ugly. And the ugly has to do with addiction, ballot measure 110, and challenges that we're seeing coming in from Portland, being quite frank. So for those of you that may not recall, there was a ballot measure about 1.5 years, almost 2 years ago, called ballot measure 110. And what it did was, it was titled the Drug Treatment and Recovery Act. And it passed overwhelmingly by the voters. And what it did essentially was it created a new structure to provide resources for people dealing with addiction. It also decriminalized the possession of a user level amount of drugs. So when I say user level amount, I'm not talking about drug dealers who are possessing a large amount to go sell it. Not talking about manufacturers that are creating drugs. That's still illegal. But if you are possessing an amount of drugs for you to use, or a small amount for you to share, that is no longer criminal in Oregon. It is against the law, but it is not criminal. So crime. So that's what possessing drugs is like. Let me give you kind of an example of how that plays out. If I walk down the street full of heroin and I injected it myself while I'm walking past the police officer, and the officer says, "Are you injecting yourself with heroin?" And I say, "Yes, I am." The officer then has one option. The officer can give me a ticket. Well, here's your ticket. The ticket will tell me I have to show up in court probably 30 days from now, and I have to explain myself to a judge. And when I go to court, the judge can either give me a fine anywhere between $45 and $100, or if I agree to call a 1-800 number and talk to someone on the phone about what my treatment options are, that fine can be wiped away. So take the average person addicted to heroin or methamphetamine and go back to the situation where they get the ticket from the officer. What do you think most of them do with that ticket?
Garbage.
Yeah. Smoke it, throw it away, smoke it. They don't come to court. The vast majority of people, and this has been proven now in the last 16 months, this is what we are seeing. The vast majority of people just don't show up. And so what happens if you don't show up?
Nothing.
Yeah, basically nothing. You will have what's called a default judgment against you, which means you owe $100. But if you're someone who's addicted to heroin or meth, that's likely not something you really care about, having a $100 judgment hanging over your head. If you do show up, you can, as I said, you can pay $45 up to $100, depending on what a judge decides for you. Or you can pick up the phone and do this telephone call I'm telling you about, this 1-800 number. So in the last 16 months, that measure 110 has been in effect. Does anyone have a guess about how many people have actually accessed treatment following that 1-800 number call?
5%.
Less than 10, less than 5. So 24 is the number. People.
People. Out of how many?
People.
Out of how many?
Oh,
Yeah.
thousands. I mean, so the entire state over the last 16 months, 24 people have called that number and indicated a desire to seek treatment. And these are people who otherwise weren't planning on seeking treatment. So you take the total number of people who called the number and said, "Oh, I already am getting treatment," it's something like 100 people. So 24 new people getting access to treatment because of this law is what I'm talking about. Now, a law titled the Drug Treatment and Recovery Act, a law that I'm guessing most people in this room who voted for it thought would actually increase the level of treatment. Now, I'll just be really upfront. Not everybody agrees with me. If I were standing here with people who support this law, they would, argue and say, "No, Kevin, this law does other things that you're not highlighting." And it's true, it does. It provides all sorts of other services to people, and good services like what are called peer mentors and support services for people that are dealing with addictions. So that's all good things. But I'm focusing on the treatment because at the end of the day, we're dealing with a drug epidemic where we have overdose deaths that are skyrocketing. We have overdose incidents, not just where they die, but just their overdosing skyrocketing. First responders administering what's called Narcan, which is the counter agent for someone experiencing an overdose, skyrocketing. Children who are exposed to drugs, so these are younger kids who have either meth or heroin in their system, also increasing, and property crime, because property crime has a significant connection or nexus to addiction. And we're seeing, and you're all hearing about it in the community, I know, catalytic converter theft increasing, vehicle theft increasing, car break-ins increasing. So can I say that ballot measure 110 is causing all of this to happen? No, I can't say that. There's too much going on at once to say that A causes B. But can I tell you it's like throwing gasoline on the fire? Absolutely. And that's the struggle that we're dealing with. On top of that struggle, we're dealing with what's happening in Portland. And I used to think, you know, Portland is kind of like my next door neighbor, but it's over there, I'm over here. But crime does not stop at the county line at all, especially with Max. Crime does not stop at the county line. And what we're seeing is increasing amount of crime coming into Washington County from Portland. And that's been a real challenge. And a challenge because we can't really get at the heart of that crime because a number of these people committing the crime don't live here. They'll commit a crime, a shoplifting, a burglary, a car theft, catalytic converter theft, and they'll go back to Portland where they came from. So we've been tracking burglaries, car thefts, car break-ins, firearms offenses, robberies. And we're noticing when we look at who are we prosecuting today compared to who are we prosecuting 3 years ago. And we compare how many people are from Portland today compared to 3 years ago, because 3 years ago is kind of pre-pandemic. It's the last normal year that we had. We're looking at double-digit increases in the percentages of defendants, criminals who are coming into our county and committing this crime. So that's a big challenge as well. So I don't want to end on a bad note, but I wanted to paint for you a picture of some of the challenges that we have. And I'll just kind of circle back to, again, don't forget, we have a very strong, well-functioning public safety system here. And in Forest Grove, you've got a very good police department. I mean, every police department has its challenges. Every police department will be in the news every once in a while. You've got a good chief, a good police department, and it's a strong relationship between all the cities that help make our public safety system work really well. So thank you for the time, and happy to answer any other questions you all might have.
In a nutshell, if that's even possible, what's being done to fix this?
Well, I mean, lots of little things. So in my experience working in the system, it's very rare to have a single answer to a complex problem. You know, the silver bullet, very rarely does that exist. So there's lots of little things that are happening to address it. And one bright spot that I'll share with you is we have this wonderful nonprofit in Washington County called the Family Justice Center. The Family Justice Center is it's an adult domestic violence kind of one-stop shopping place where people who are dealing with trauma in the home can go. And we are working to expand the focus of our adult domestic violence center to include all forms of family trauma, child abuse, and other violence happening in the home. The reason I say that's a good thing is we know there's a significant correlation between trauma and negative things happening to people when they're younger and challenges later in life, like addiction and mental health issues and general behavior. There's actually a word for it. It's called ACEs. It's an acronym. It stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, ACEs. If you Google that, you'll see there's a whole body of literature that talks about basically the more bad stuff that happens when you're younger that goes unaddressed, the greater the number of challenges we're going to see in the system later on that I'm going to see in my office. So a number of us have come together to say, hey, let's do more when we got these teenagers and young adults so that we can try and address this really at the root cause or the upstream so we can stop a lot of this addiction and mental health issue from happening. It's not the silver bullet, but it'll have a huge impact in a positive way. Yes, sir.
On that topic, what if you had to look at like types of crimes that you're doing with, what percentage of that is that domestic abuse, child abuse, all of that? How much of a percentage, if that's what's kind of feeding into the rest of it?
Yeah. So I don't have a number off the top of my head for you about, and that's an easily obtainable number for me to all the cases we see, what percentage qualify as what type of crime.
Right.
What I can tell you is with child abuse, domestic violence, and sexual assault, those are the crimes that there's a significant disconnect between what's actually happening and what we see. So for example, car theft, almost all car thefts are always reported to the police. You know why? There's two reasons. One, they're really expensive cars, and two, you gotta file a police report to get an insurance to cover it, right? So even criminals will call the police, say my car was stolen. Now, domestic violence or sexual assault, we know a significant amount of that, which happens behind closed doors when other people aren't watching. Child abuse, same thing. A significant percentage is not reported. So there's a big disconnect between what happens and what gets reported. And so,
I mean, I brought it up because a few years ago, I got called to jury. And I was put on a grand jury, which up to that point, I had no idea what a grand jury was. Yeah, I just thought it was a super special jury, but you know, and it's like what, 5 weeks?
yep,
to do that?
4 or 5 weeks, right?
So a month, basically. And honestly, a very interesting experience, but I left just feeling so down and depressed. It was horrible because, and I don't know if it was just a particularly bad month, but almost every case that we were dealing with was underage sexual assault, little kids. And I'm like, what is happening? Right, and so that's why I asked, what's the percentage of that? And
Well, we are an office of 40 lawyers. We have 130 people in the office, 40 lawyers. 5 of them only handle those types of cases. So it gives you an idea. So 5 people full-time, that's all they do. And that's actually what I did. I supervised that unit, our child abuse unit, for about, 10 years before I became the DA. That's the unit I worked in. And it does tear down your faith in the community to see that day after.
and I did for a month.
Yeah, but I mean, I'll tell you this, so I would frequently get asked, how do you do that? Or why do you do that? And as hard as it is, you get to help people out in the worst moment of your life. And I think that's the difference. So as a grand juror, when you're sitting there hearing it all, you're soaking it all in, you can't take action. When you're a prosecutor and you hear about, let's say, a 5-year-old whose stepfather raped her, which sounds awful, but it happens. When you hear about that, the next thing you get to do is you get to meet her and you get to help her through this difficult, unfriendly court process that was never meant for kids. And you get to take her all the way through it to the point where she has to testify in court and be cross-examined by the attorney who's representing the man that raped her. But then you can make it so that her life is better after that, and that this man will never do that to her or anybody else again. And then you get to basically keep doing that day in and day out to help people, and that's what keeps you going. So it's a tough job, but being able to help people is really what gives you that energy.
Appreciate you, Kevin.
Hey,
Yes.
thank you all.
Thank you.